The brain consists of 4 major parts, and the first thing you want to do on this section is get those 4 major parts of the brain down. Make sure that you can write those, because what we're going to do is go into each of those 4 major parts and look at the different regions or different, subparts they're comprised of and their function. So we have the largest part of the brain, and that's the cerebrum. So let me get my pointer up. So this whole part of the brain is going to be the cerebrum. We have the brainstem, which is going to be the part of the brain that actually attaches to the spinal cord, which you can see just a little nub of the spinal cord down here. And on the brains that we dissect, usually this is where the spinal cord's cut off. We usually have just a little small nub that's still intact on those. So we've got the cerebrum, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and I know this is not a good analogy, but the cerebellum always kind of reminds me of like a little clump of cauliflower attached to the back of the brain. So cerebrum, brainstem, cerebellum. And then we have the diencephalon. The diencephalon we can't see out here, so they've made our little brain illustration kind of see-through so that we can see that diencephalon there on the inside. And I am going to pause this for just a second and let my dog outside. I'm sure you can hear her barking. I'll be right back. Okay, so cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and diencephalon. Okay, now let's take a closer look at the brainstem. So if we look at this illustration, we can see that all of this structure highlighted in green represents the brainstem. And the brainstem is actually comprised of 3 major regions. We've got the medulla, which is this part here, the pons, and the midbrain. So if we look on this next slide, the brainstem is, of course, going to be the part of the brain that's physically attached to the spinal cord. And if we look down here, the medulla, or medulla oblongata, is the particular part of the brainstem that's attached to the spinal cord. And then we have the pons and the midbrain. So there's a few things we want to think about with the brainstem. Okay, if we look on the inside of that brainstem, a significant portion of it is going to be comprised of gray matter. So there's unmyelinated neurons. And then there's going to be these little patches of white matter that's just kind of dispersed among that gray matter. So we've got a large area of gray matter, and then we've got little patches of white matter. We call that the reticular formation. And I'm going to skip to this next slide for just a second, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so when we look at this illustration, we have removed the cerebrum. That's the biggest part of the brain. And we're only seeing half of the cerebellum. And our focus for this is going to be the brainstem right here. So this has actually been dissected. So we're looking at a cross section of it. So here's the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain right up here. Okay, this is actually our diencephalon. We'll look at here in a little bit. And that's the inside of the cerebellum. So if we look, here's that reticular formation. So this, if we look on the inside of the brainstem as a whole, we're going to have that gray matter interdispersed with myelinated neurons. And one of the reasons that this reticular formation is significant is that it's actually going to have both sensory and motor function. So basically what we're saying by that is that there's input and output initiated here in the brainstem. And as we cover particular body systems this semester, we'll come back and talk about the brainstem in a lot more depth then. But we're going to talk about how regions, and we'll look and touch on that in just a second here, how regions of the brainstem help regulate heart rate and how they help regulate respiration and breathing and so forth. But it's also this in particular, this reticular formation is involved in regulating, alerting your cerebral cortex to incoming information, and it helps keep you conscious and wake up once you go to sleep. So that's just a few significant things about this reticular formation. Okay, now if we look at the medulla or medulla oblongata itself, like we mentioned, that is the specific part of the brainstem that's continued or attached to the spinal cord, and it serves as a major reflex center that helps us regulate, like we'd mentioned previously, heart rate, respiration, vomiting, sneezing, coughing, hiccuping, swallowing. And keep in mind here, we're saying reflex center. And again, we're going to come back to that as we cover cardiovascular and respiratory systems. We're going to talk a lot more about these different regions of the brain. And it's also going to be the origin of these particular cranial nerves. We're going to kind of cover those cranial nerves separately in lab. Okay, so remember the four major parts of the brain. If we just review really quick, we've got cerebrum, that's the biggest part of the brain. Cerebellum, that little clump of cauliflower on the back. The brainstem, and the diencephalon. So we're working through the three parts of the brainstem. We've got the medulla, that's the part that's actually attached to the spinal cord. And then we have the pons. There's little axon bundles that actually serve as a bridgeway to help attach the cerebellum to the brainstem and kind of let those two parts of the brain communicate with each other. So I'm going to back up real quick to this so we can see here's the cerebellum, here's the pons. So we're saying there's these little bundles of axons that kind of anchor these two structures together. Okay, the pons also help send information associated with skeletal muscle to the cerebral cortex, or from the cerebral cortex, I'm sorry, to the cerebellum. Noticed my cerebral cortex in this. I always forget to, when I update this set of notes, to correct that. So this is cerebral cortex. Origin of these particular cranial nerves, which again we'll be looking at in lab. And it also houses the aponeutic and pneumataxic area. So again, these are going to be regions of the brain that we're going to talk quite a bit more about when we get to the respiratory system. So the pneumataxic and aponeutic area are going to work with the medulla to help regulate and control respiration or breathing. Okay, then we've got the midbrain or mesencephalon. It connects the pons and the diencephalon, that next part of the brain. And it's going to help relay motor impulses, so remember that's output, from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and spinal cord. It also plays a role in regulating visual and auditory reflexes. So again, note that word reflex. So we're not saying this is the part of the brain that lets you hear and see. It's the part of the brain that is regulating reflexes associated with vision and hearing. Okay, so there's the brainstem. Now the cerebellum. So that little structure, which is actually not that little, kind of attached to the brainstem back there. So it's actually attached to the brainstem by these bundles of myelinated axons, and we call them cerebellar peduncles. And they basically are going to help relay information between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain. The cerebellum also plays a major role in skeletal muscle tissue. So when you think skeletal muscle, a significant part of the cerebellum is due to that. So it plays a role in maintaining muscle tone, balance, posture, and just overall contraction of the skeletal muscle. If we look at the cerebellum, there's going to be this central constricted region called the vermis. And we'll be looking at this when we dissect the brains. And it allows us to kind of separate, if you will, the cerebellum into two hemispheres or two regions. So these are our two cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, also, and let's see, if we look, and we'll be able to really see this on when we dissect the brains. When we do a cross section of the cerebellum, and I'm going to flip to the slide just for a second so that we can see this, there's going to be a distinct pattern formed between the myelinated neurons. So we'll see a very distinct visual image formed between the gray and white matter. And those myelinated neurons, that white matter, forms a tree-like pattern, which we actually call the tree of life. So we'll be able to see that really well when we dissect the brain. Okay, so we've got the brainstem, the cerebellum, and now the diencephalon. The diencephalon, so if we do a cross-section of the brain and we look on the inside, that's where we're going to find the diencephalon. And it consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the diencephalon, this section. And we're going to talk a lot more about it for exam 2. So something that I want you to go ahead and make note of. Right here is the pituitary gland. And the brains that we will be dissecting should have pituitary glands still intact. So hopefully they will, and we'll be able to see this. But your pituitary gland is often referred to as a master gland of the endocrine system because it makes and or releases so many hormones that go out and boss all the other hormones around. So your pituitary gland is like a major regulator of homeostasis. And remember, in our last section, we looked at kind of that relationship between the nervous system and endocrine system. And we said ultimately the nervous system sits back and monitors everything and receives tons of input and decides if we need to respond to changes, and if so, how. And oftentimes, as part of that decision, the brain decides we need to send out particular hormones to help us respond. So right here, we're literally seeing the physical association between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus of the brain by a little stalk of tissue, which we'll look at pictures that show this a lot better a little bit later. But this little stalk of tissue is called the infundibulum. So pituitary gland attached to the hypothalamus by way of the infundibulum. Okay, and if we zoom in on that a little bit, there we can see that pituitary gland. Here's the hypothalamus, and we're seeing that infundibulum just a little bit. Okay, something else that I want you to make note of, which we'll be able to see when we do the brain dissections. This structure right here is comprised of the optic nerves, and we'll talk about what that is when we dissect those brains. So just know right here, close to the pituitary gland, look right next to it, are the optic nerves. So when we get to that section of the endocrine system, we're going to talk about how disorders such as tumors, for example, of the pituitary gland, can actually sometimes damage the optic nerves or cause visual symptoms. Okay, so hypothalamus, in a nutshell, is considered a major regulator of homeostasis. Okay, one reason for that is because it is physically attached to the pituitary gland, and it basically tells the pituitary gland what to do. So the hypothalamus determines if the pituitary gland is going to send out its hormones. And just know there's a lot of different hormones made by the pituitary gland. Okay, pituitary gland itself is actually structurally and functionally divided into two regions. So if we say it's divided into two structurally distinct regions, that tells us, well, there's physically two different parts. It's one little tiny gland, but there's two parts. And if it's structurally different, that means those two regions are made or comprised of different types of cells or different tissue. So if we find different cells in each part, it tells us it's functionally different. So we have what we call the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary is comprised of 5 different types of cells, each of which makes and releases at least one hormone. And it's the hypothalamus that tells the anterior pituitary release or don't release those hormones. Okay, posterior pituitary gland does not actually make hormones. It simply stores 2 hormones that are being synthesized right up here in the hypothalamus. So there are special neurons here in the there's neurons here that do what any other neuron would do. They release neurotransmitters and so forth. But there's also going to be a couple of types of neurons that are modified. And these modified neurons don't make neurotransmitters. They actually produce hormones. And the axons of those neurons travel down through the infundibulum. And the axon terminal terminates in the posterior pituitary, and that's where those 2 hormones are stored. So those 2 hormones, which we're going to talk a lot about later on, are oxytocin. And for now, just think oxytocin plays a major role in labor and delivery. It causes contraction of the smooth muscle. So the uterus starts to contract, and those contractions get stronger and closer together so that you can have baby. Oxytocin also has receptors in different parts of the brain, and it plays a role in your ability to form, for a lack of a better term, bond with mom, bond with other individuals, and it plays a role in your perception of certain types of social situations. So we'll talk about a potential link to autism and oxytocin. Sometimes oxytocin is called the cuddle hormone. When you hug somebody, for example, it's dopamine and some other things that are released that make you feel happy, but also oxytocin. And it's also oxytocin that gives rise to the rhythmic muscle contraction that you experience during an orgasm. Okay, and we'll talk a lot more about this hormone when we get to the endocrine system. So oxytocin, made up here in the hypothalamus, stored in posterior pituitary. And the second one is a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. And I have horribly misspelled this, antidiuretic hormone. Let's see. My screen's locked up. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, and like I was saying, I think I may have misspelled diuretic, but antidiuretic hormone, or that's abbreviated ADH, and it's also known as vasopressin. So it's got a couple of different names. And again, we're going to talk about this one a lot more when we get to the endocrine system. But for now, if we just look at this name, anti-diuretic hormone. So think about what a diuretic would do. A diuretic makes you urinate a lot. It helps you get rid of excess fluid. So what would an anti-diuretic do? It would help you retain fluid. So imagine what type of situation would your body be experiencing for part of your brain to say, I've got to send out an anti-diuretic hormone so that we keep fluid in the body. Basically, you're losing too much fluid. You're dehydrating, you're vomiting, you're sweating too much. So any of those situations, your hypothalamus tells the posterior pituitary to release anti-diuretic hormone. And again, when we get to the endocrine system, we're going to talk quite a bit more in depth about that. So pituitary gland, part of your endocrine system, physically attached to the hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that's kind of specifically given the title of being regulator of homeostasis. They're attached by that little stalk of tissue called the infundibulum. And hopefully they did send the brains as we ordered them with that infundibulum and pituitary gland intact. So this is the physical link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Pituitary glands divided into anterior and posterior pituitary. Anterior, made of 5 different types of cells. Each of those cells makes at least one hormone that goes out and controls some major things in the body. Posterior pituitary doesn't make any hormones. It simply stores these 2 hormones, oxytocin and ADH, which the hypothalamus makes. Okay, and then last thing we want to think about with the hypothalamus is it also serves for the center for hunger and thirst, and this is where your body temperature is regulated. So, and those of you that have had micro, you may remember this a little bit. Sometimes when you have infections, your immune cells try to attack those microbes, and in response, they release special chemicals that are part of your immune system that travel to the hypothalamus and, in essence, turn the body's thermostat up. So you run a fever when you're sick for a couple of reasons. Those microbes don't do as well at elevated temperatures, and part of your immune system works better at elevated temperatures. Okay, so that's the hypothalamus. So remember, we kind of got a little sidetracked, so let's make sure everybody remembers 4 major regions of the brain. Okay, we've already talked about the brainstem, and the brainstem consists of the medulla, pons, and midbrain. Okay, we've talked about the cerebellum, little clump on the back. Remember, we've got that central constricted region, the vermis, that almost divides it into those 2 hemispheres. And then we talked about that tree of life. And big thing with that cerebellum is you think about skeletal muscle. I'm sorry, I forgot the type of muscle, skeletal muscle. Okay, and now we are on the diencephalon. And the diencephalon consists of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So we've kind of just briefly summarized the hypothalamus. Now let's think of the thalamus. Okay, the thalamus serves as a major relay station for a lot of your senses. So everything as far as your senses go, with the exception of olfaction, information is going to be sent to the thalamus. Thalamus processes it, and then the thalamus sends that information out to the part of the brain that's going to be able to say, oh, this is what you see, or oh, this is what I hear, and so forth. This is also the part of the brain where information is received regarding pain that allows you to consciously recognize that pain. To some degree, temperature and certain types of tactile sensations. It's also going to be part of the limbic system, which we're going to talk next week in lab just a tiny bit more about. But when you think limbic system, think about emotions. And I don't want to say much more about that right now because the activity we'll do next week in lab hopefully will kind of illustrate this. Okay, so we've got diencephalon, brainstem, cerebellum, and now the last part of the brain, the cerebrum. And this is going to be the largest part of the brain. Okay, the surface layer is called the cerebral cortex. And that cerebral cortex has just like an unreal ability to process information. They're looking at billions of neurons. Okay, it is comprised of gray matter, so they are unmyelinated neurons. This is the major part of your brain that controls thought and other conscious behavior and conscious activity. Complex integrative functions like emotions, memory, your ability to reason are all tied to this part of the brain. Your cerebrum is divided into lobes by these folds and fissures, which we'll actually look at when we dissect the brain. And if we look on our next slide, okay, we're seeing the cerebrum, so we're looking down at the top of the brain, and we'll see that there's this pretty prominent fissure, the longitudinal fissure. Now, the term fissure is nothing unique to the brain. It just means crevice or cracks. You can have fissures in rocks and so forth. So this longitudinal fissure is going to divide the cerebrum into two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. Now, once we identify in our brain dissection some external structures, we'll actually take our scalpel and we'll dissect the brain completely in half by way of this longitudinal fissure. And if we had the brain, we could kind of grab each side and we could give it a little tug and pull, and we would see that it doesn't completely separate it. But as we cut down into it, and we'll come back to the slide in just a second, but as we cut into it, we're going to see there's a whole bunch of these transverse fibers that we call the corpus callosum. And this keeps the left and right cerebral hemispheres physically attached to each other, and it lets them talk to each other. And just as a note, right in here is where we're going to find that lateral and third ventricle. Okay, so looks like it's completely separated in half, but it's not. They're still connected by the corpus callosum. Okay, so each hemisphere can function separately. The left hemisphere responds to information coming from the right side of your body and vice versa. So they control opposite sides of the body. The left side controls the right side of the body. Right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere deals mainly with speech. So we think about written and spoken language, analytical skills. So when we think about the left hemispheres, that's where we usually think about like logic and science and math and things like that. Okay, the right hemisphere we tend to associate with more creative, artistic activities. So if you're creative, you're good at, painting, drawing, music, and so forth. It would be the right side. Okay, the reality is, and this is like a thing that used to be debated. We used to say, and I'm really kind of just being generic with this description and kind of stereotyping and generalizing, but we used to say you're either a left brain or a right brain. So one dominates over the other. So you're either going to be really good at, physics and math and science and all of those kind of analytical, scientific things, or you're going to be really artistic. You like to dance and you're good at music and you can sing and paint and all of those things. But the reality is that we use both sides and you can actually be good at both of these things. There's so much more going on than just that. And I always, without getting, into the psychology and nature versus nurture and all of that stuff, just imagine if you grew up in a home where you were exposed from birth to lots of science. I mean, you always talked about science. You know, you grew up in a lab. You were always exposed to that. That may come more naturally to you. That does not mean that you also may not have creative artistic abilities as well. Or it could be the opposite. Maybe you grew up, you know, you were never exposed to science. You never did math. You know, you never had those deep analytical conversations. You always just, like a free spirit, you painted, you know, listened to music and so forth. Maybe you grew up in a home where both were valued. So that's not saying that some individuals certainly can be born with a natural inclination, again, for lack of a better word, for one of the other. But we certainly use both, and for most individuals, it's not that one dominates over the other. I mean, a lot of science people are actually artists as well, and I think most science people that I know, they either paint and draw, or they're also musicians. You know, a lot of them even have their own bands. So just that's kind of my little getting up on my soapbox with this. Okay, so we've got the cerebrum divided into the left and right hemispheres. Each of those hemispheres is going to be further subdivided into lobes. So we've got 4 lobes, and hopefully these names sound familiar to you. The frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. So remember when you learned the names of those bones in the skull? Okay, the location of those bones correspond to the location of these lobes of the cerebrum. So we know that it is way more complex than this. But in general, the frontal lobe, primary motor area, it is, my screen is locked up again, I'm sorry. Okay, hopefully you guys can see the picture here. Parietal, your general senses and the sense of taste or gustation. Temporal, that's going to be olfaction or the sense of smell and hearing. And occipital, that's the primary area for vision or sight. Okay, so you want to make sure that you can list the 4 major parts of the brain. So cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, and brainstem. Once you can write all 4 of those out, you want to go back and write the regions of each. So for example, under the cerebrum, you're going to have left and right hemispheres. And then each hemisphere is divided into temporal, occipital, frontal, and parietal lobes. Okay, brainstem, medulla, pons, and midbrain. Diencephalon, thalamus, and hypothalamus. So make sure you can go through and associate each of those. And then you want to go back and be able at this point to associate each region of the brain. And we've certainly not done it justice or gone into any depth, but associate each region of the brain with a major function or significance of that region. And then last thing we want to look at are the cranial nerves. And we're going to pick back up with this when we do the brain dissection. But you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves that originate from the base of the brain. They're named based on how they're distributed, and they're numbered by order of attachment. So for all 12 of those cranial nerves, they're basically going to be given a number, which we designate with Roman numerals, so 1 through 12, and then they're also given a common name. So on this little chart, this kind of simplifies it as much as we can. What you want to, if you want to go ahead and start looking at, which we'll be working on after our brain dissection, is you will have a quiz. It will be matching. I won't require you to write it all out, where you will have to match the cranial nerve Roman numeral to its name. So cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. What does the olfactory nerve do? Smell or olfaction. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. This does vision. Okay, cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, does lots of things. It helps with chewing, face and mouth, tactile and pain sensations in your face and mouth. Okay, so as you go through this, your cranial nerve 7, vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, this is basically what we call the auditory nerve. This is associated with hearing and equilibrium and balance. So you want to make sure that you can match the Roman numeral to the common name and the overall function.